I am Dial Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is my author feature of the month. He's award-winning author and best-selling author to no other than Mr. Sebastien de Castell.
Hi, Daniel. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Mr. Sebastian. As usual, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. For those who haven't seen some of our other episodes together, I'm Sebastien de Castell. I'm a Canadian fantasy novelist. I've had 16 books published, novels published, and one short story collection as well. The main series I'm most known for, well, there's two. One is The Greatcoats, which is an adult swashbuckling fantasy series. It's a little bit like The Three Musketeers meets Game of Thrones. And the second big series I'm known for is a young adult magical fantasy series called Spellslinger, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Yes, indeed. So what is the central theme or message you want to convey in Spellslinger?
I think the most important thing about Spellslinger for me, and you know, as we've discussed before, you know, when you're writing a novel, you don't really think in terms of, okay, I have a message I want to convey. What you have is kind of a curiosity. Like there's something that you're thinking about that's rolling around the back of your head that comes out of just looking out at the world and seeing things in the world and going, well, that doesn't connect with my own thinking. And you're not quite sure what that gap is, but that gap is very important because that gap for me is where kind of the creative impulse stems from. And so with Spellslinger, I think a big part of it was, you know, I'd read some wonderful YA fantasy novels, you know, for example, you know, the Harry Potter books, which I really enjoyed. And I think, you know, a lot of young people became readers as a result of Harry Potter. I know for a lot of people, J.K. Rowling is a controversial figure now, but I think the books themselves were a really positive force in the world. And I'm not criticizing J.K. Rowling at all. I take no position on the controversy right now. But what did kind of strike me as odd about the Harry Potter books and so many other fantasy novels at the time was this idea that your main character is someone who appears on the surface to be completely normal and average and dull, and in fact, you know, stuck with their terrible aunt and uncle, and their parents must not have loved them very much, and they're quite poor, and nobody really likes them, only to discover that they have this incredible magical destiny before them, that they have this talent, that they're actually more powerful than everyone else around them, that they're going to be the key player in this great unfolding story. That it turns out they're secretly rich and their parents actually love them more than everyone else. And oddly, that wasn't my experience of being a teenager. When I was a teenager, I always distinctly remember being 16 years old in front of my locker at high school, and the first bell was ringing, and seeing all my classmates sort of moving through the halls and thinking to myself, you know, I'm not the smartest person in my school. I'm not the most athletic person in my school. I'm not the most talented person in my school. I'm certainly not the best looking person in my school. I don't even have the nicest personality in my school. I am completely not special. And so I remember seeing that reaction in a lot of people, and people tend to fall into two camps when they come to that realization that, hey, I'm not who I kind of imagined I was going to be when I was a little, you know, when I was 6. Now I'm 16 and I don't seem to be special. One reaction is people just go, you know what? I bet I am special. I just have to wait. I'll keep waiting, and then destiny will call for me, right? And a lot of those people actually tend to quite love fantasy novels because it's an escape into that type of world. A second group of people become quite cynical, and they go, you know what? Nobody's special. Nothing matters. There's no point. I was kind of lucky because I remember going to see my family shortly after that revelation and saying, I feel like I'm not really special. And oddly, my family's reaction was to sort of look at me and go, yeah, you're right. You're not really special. So what are you going to do about it? And that for me was kind of a really important moment in my life, because it taught me that, you shouldn't want to be born special. You should want to earn that specialness. You should want to find whatever interesting little things there are about yourself and go out and develop those. And that is, what kind of drove Spellslinger, the idea of a young man who's, raised in this very magical society. His parents are legendary mages themselves. His younger sister is the most talented mage of their generation. It's the only thing he cares about. And he's on the verge of his mage's trials that will, make him a full member of his clan and give him this lofty title of mage of the Jantep, only to find his own magic is disappearing. And so the question for Kellen and the question for the reader becomes, what do you do next? And of course, Kellen's solution is, I'm going to figure out some way to get my magic no matter what. And I remember even when I was meeting with my editors, because the Spellslinger was bought in an 8-book deal, which is a big, it's a lot of books for a publisher to commit to. And I remember my editor at the time saying, well, he's going to just slowly get more and more powerful over the series, right? He's going to get all that magic that he wants. And I said, no, he's going to learn other ways to be a trickster, to survive in this world. And lucky for Kellen, he meets a woman named Ferius Parfax, who you can see on the upside down of this cover, who is what's called an Argosi. And she has no magic of her own, but she's afraid of no one. And she swaggers through the world, and she gets by on all of these brilliant tricks and talents that are all based on things that all of us have as human beings. Eloquence, a swagger, dance, all of these sort of things that martial arts, things that you can turn into these amazing talents. And so that's kind of what when I get a lot of letters from readers of Spellslinger, some of them teenagers, some of them actually adults, some of them quite old adults. And what they always say, which is the thing that makes me happiest, is that when they read the Spellslinger series, they realize that they don't have to try to be like someone else. They don't have to try to be special on someone else's terms. They can find their own path and develop their own talents so that in the aggregate, we become someone special. You don't have to be the fastest runner. You can just be a pretty okay runner, but also maybe a pretty good martial artist, not the best martial artist, but maybe also learn to play the violin. You don't have to be the greatest violin player. But when you take all of those things together and you combine them, you become somebody very interesting. And so that's really what it's about.
Yes, indeed. So who is your target audience and how it influenced your writing style?
So I never really write with a target audience in mind, because I think the strongest way to write a novel is that you try to write the book that you most want to read in the boldest way you know how. So don't restrain yourself. Try to write for yourself, in terms of writing a book that you think is just, fills you with excitement when you read it back. And I recently reread all the Spellslinger books, and my favorite thing is that I can reread them and just enjoy them myself as a reader, which means I accomplished, for me, the most important thing, which is just write the book that I wanted to read. And I think when you do that, you're more likely to tap into things that other people want to read. And as I say, the audience of Spellslinger is very interesting. So first of all, something a lot of people don't realize is that there's actually very little young adult fiction, specifically very little young adult fantasy that's targeted at teenage boys. Most readers after middle grade books, so after sort of about 12 years of age, tends to be girls that are reading. Boys tend to stop reading as much. They tend to move more onto video games and things like that. And so as a result, there's actually very few YA novels that feature a male protagonist. It's not that there aren't any. There are some, but there's vastly more. If you just go to a bookstore and just look on the shelves, you'll see an incredible and wonderful array of fantasy and YA novels generally for female readers. But there's not a lot for male readers. And interestingly, I think that's one of the reasons why the Spellslinger series has sold as well as it has around the world. It's been translated into 13 or 14 languages. It's been optioned for film and television. And part of it is, I think, librarians. I often see tweets from librarians saying, here's the book I give to boys so that they'll get back into reading. So I'm very happy that it reaches those readers. But of course, because the body of readers globally generally is more women than men, or more girls than boys, when I get letters from readers, at least as often it'll be female readers as male readers. And I think part of that is because I think when you write a novel, or certainly the way that I tend to try to write, is that I'm not overly concerned with gender. I'm not overly concerned with age. I'm not overly concerned with race. It's not that those things aren't important. It's not that they're not worthy topics. It's just that for the types of books that I write, I'm more concerned with the things that we all feel. You and I may have completely different backgrounds, for example. I don't know your history that well, other than that you actually live fairly close to me, as it turns out. But and you may not know too much about my personal background, but we both probably, I'm willing to bet, know what it's like to feel lonely. I bet we both know what it feels like when you suddenly find yourself good at something. Or we both know what it feels like to think that we've let someone down. And so those kind of things, I think, speak to all of us, and they speak to all ages. And so as much as in some ways Spellslinger is a book that is often given to teenage young men to read, it's certainly, I think it's, for me, I'm always happy that the audience that reads it, the people that write to me that say that this has meaning for them, come from every demographic imaginable and all around the world.
Definitely. So what is the main plot of Spellslinger, and how does it progress from beginning to end without this spoiler?
Oh, good. You just describe the entire story, but with no spoilers. In essence, as I mentioned, Kellen starts the novel. He's a 16-year-old. He's on the cusp of turning 16. He's obsessed with magic. He's obsessed with passing his mage's trials. And of course, as I mentioned, the first thing that happens is he loses his magical potential. And so he becomes obsessed with trying to find it and doing anything he has to get it. But along the way, he meets Ferius Parfax, as I mentioned, and Ferius, of course, starts to show him an alternative path of saying, what if you had to make it through the world without relying on magic? And it's funny because for her, even though for Kellen and his society, magic is the most important thing imaginable, she treats magic as almost like a children's game. She thinks of people who, wanting power over other people as a kind of a very immature way to live through life. And so with her, it's all tricks and gambling and all of these talents that she starts to share with Kellen, so that as he starts to uncover the mystery of why his magic is starting to fail and why some of the magic of some of his fellow initiates is starting to fail, that he's ultimately going to be faced with a choice about which path he wants to follow for the rest of his life. Is he willing to become an outcast, or does he want to fit back in with his family and his clan?
Yes. Interesting, Mr. Sebastian. So who are your main characters, and what are their motivations and goals?
So the main character, of course, is Kellen, as I say. He's a young guy who, again, suffers from that same obsession with magic and with power that I think that all of his people do, and I think that a lot of us do today. I remember being reading fantasy when I was a teenager, and partly I just wanted, to have telepathy or to have telekinesis. Yeah, you just want something. So he has a lot of that. But what I like about Kellen as a character is that he's also quite clever. So he'll find ways around problems. And so the opening scene of Spellslinger is his first mage's trial, which is a duel involving spells, except that he has no magic at that moment. He can't make his spells work. And somehow he's got to win that mage's duel, and make everyone believe he's got magic. And so I like that part of him, that kind of cleverness. The second major character in the story is Ferius, as I mentioned, who's an Argosi. And the Argosi are these wandering philosopher gamblers who each have their own specific path and who all follow what are called the four ways: the way of water, the way of wind, the way of thunder, and the way of stone. Which are just philosophical approaches to how do you deal with other people. For example, the way of water is you should always flow around things. You shouldn't take anything and you shouldn't leave anything behind. So it's a way of trying to find a peaceful way through conflicts. The way of wind is about, following the clues and going, instead of reacting one way, I'm going to listen for clues. I'm going to try to find out what's really going on. The way of thunder is if you must act, if you must have conflict, then you do so swiftly and without remorse, and you do it as much as must be done and no more. And then the way of stone is being resistant to being pushed off your own path. Is sometimes you just have to stand up and take what's coming at you and not move. And so she's an interesting character because she has gone through so much and she keeps so many secrets to herself about her past. And those are the secrets that are explored in the Argosi series, which we've talked about in a different episode. And so she's someone who has a lot of reason to resent the Jantep, Kellen's people, but is always trying to overcome that. And so I like her as a character because she's not constantly giving in to her impulses, but is instead trying to navigate her way through the world and ask the question, how do you become someone who can survive anywhere, who can travel anywhere and go anywhere, but not actually be a warrior per se? And then the third major character, who we can kind of see an illustration of here on Kellen's shoulder, is Rikus. And Rikus is what's called a squirrel cat. They're considered to be a type of demon by the Jantep, by Kellen's people, who had tried to eradicate them. But with Rikus, I wanted to write a character that, in young fantasy novels, often there's a familiar, so an animal that's like a kind of a servant to the young mage. And I think it's an owl in Harry Potter, and in different books it's something else. But there are always these kind of utilitarian characters that all they want to do, they just love the main character unconditionally, and all they want to do is serve them and do whatever it takes to help them. And I thought, in my life, I've had a lot of cats. Those are the pets that we had, and I've never met a cat that wanted to serve anybody else. And so with Rikus, I wanted a character who was much more transactional, who had no intention of just being Kellen's familiar, but instead refers to himself as his business partner. And so his deal is he will sometimes help Kellen with Kellen's problems, and in exchange, Kellen has to help Rikus when he wants to go on a heist and steal something, because squirrel cats are unbelievably avaricious, thieving sorts of animals. And so those are the three main characters that we follow through the story.
Interesting novel, Mr. Sebastian. But before we go on, I want to shout out our listeners in which country we live? Belgium. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast, because in Brussels capital, we got 61% audience share, Flanders at 31%, and Wallonia at 8%. Again, thank you so much for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers, authors all over the world, like Mr. Sebastien de Castell. So, can you share to us the research process of this novel?
Yeah, well, of course, this being a fantasy novel, it's less and this type of fantasy novel, even more so than, let's say, my other series like the Greycoats, is less driven by sort of replicating or drawing from historical sources in our own world. It's more in its own world. It has some resonances with aspects of our world. Part of what interested me was trying to create a kind of version of the New World, like a continent, where uh, where all of these other countries had sort of come over, but they were sort of influenced by, for example, the idea of, what if the ancient Egyptians had kept sort of going into the 17th century? Now, of course, Egyptian people and Egyptian culture has persisted, but the Egyptian people, as a sort of a semi-imperial nation, stops, not early in the first and second century AD. Is where that a lot of that sort of fades out. And so, what would they look like if they were in a kind of a cowboy era? And the same with the Romans, who of course sort of disappear. Don't disappear, but the Roman Empire sort of starts to crumble around the fourth and fifth centuries AD. And so what would they look like as kind of a cowboy culture? Because there's a sort of a Western flavor to Spellslinger. And so that was kind of a big part of what made it fun to build up those cultures and those nations. But the most challenging part of the research process was internal. So when you're trying to write a young adult novel and you're, an old guy, or you're anyone over the age of the characters that you're writing, the tendency is to write as if you're looking back. So it's to write as if your narrative voice is your, let's say, 40-year-old self, kind of judging your 16-year-old self. So you'll tend to write scenes as if with a certain kind of irony. So if your 16-year-old character is obsessed with love for someone else, right, you'll tend to write that scene as if it's self-evidently ironic, that of course that's not real love. Of course he's just infatuated, right? But that's not what it's like to be 16. And when you write that way, I think you run the risk of talking down to your readers. And so the hardest part of the research for me was the internal process of going, what were my feelings? What were my views? What was my lens on the world when I was 16? How did I see these things unfold? And that's especially challenging in a way because I think 16-year-olds have a certain cynicism sometimes about the world. I certainly did as a kid, but it's a different cynicism than I might have as a 40-year-old. And so trying to write from the point of view of a 16-year-old who's trying to think of themselves as being worldly and experienced, but is actually experiencing things very much for the first time. And young adult fiction is very much about first experiences. What is first love? What is the first time you have a huge, conflict or separation from your family? What is the first experience of realizing you might not be the person you always thought you were going to become? So that was the hardest part, was finding that voice for Kellen, and making that as authentic as I could in terms of thinking back. What was it really like? Like, what did it really feel like day to day to be a 16-year-old?
Definitely. So, what is your revision process in Spellsinger?
The revision process? I was really lucky because I have a group of friends in a writing group. And so we will share work with each other, and they will sort of go through, line by line. We'll go through each other's work, and people give critique. Sometimes it's big things, sometimes it's little things. And so that process is often a helpful one for finding where the pieces of your book are that are really, really strong and grab people, and which parts are what we could say utilitarian pieces. So an example of a utilitarian sort of chapter is you need your character to go from this town to this town, and you're just sort of describing them going through that process, but nothing really changes about them or about the story in a meaningful way. And those are very, very dangerous chapters to keep inside of a book, because that's where people will stop reading. And so having some pretty good cynical fellow writers read through the book and go, I've seen this before. This is, that kind of helps a lot. And then of course, I was very lucky to work with really lovely editor on Spellslinger, and then a new editor on some of the later books, and then a new editor after that. And so I've always been really blessed to have really excellent editors. And on this one, I think one of the things that my editor pushed me towards was I would have a tendency in the early drafts of kind of glossing over the magic, because for me the story is not about the magic. The story is about this, the trickery. How do you find a way to survive when you don't have magic? But she very correctly said, pointed out that for this world to feel real, you'd have to have a really strong magic system. You'd have to kind of have a sense of understanding how it works. And actually you want the reader to want that magic because Kellen wants it, which means I had to make that more vivid. And so, for example, there's a diagram, I think in the British edition, for example, that shows a little bit about the Janset system of magic and the 7 fundamental forms and how it all kind of links together. And so some of that was part of the revision process, was going, now we're going to have a little bit more precision. And then one of the things I remember in an early draft, and this is kind of a funny part of the evolution of a book that I think most of your listeners would probably never encounter, is that the artist started working on the cover before the book was completely finished. So they would commission the cover. They'd say, here's the characters. And is an absolutely amazing artist. One of my favorite illustrators, Dale Halverson. I think he goes by Joey Hi-Fi. And so we would go back and forth. There would be revisions. For example, when he was first drawing Ferius, most illustrators will not tend to draw women who are in their 30s or 40s. They either draw women who are very, very young, like kids, or women who are 20-year-olds, or women who are much older. And so it's actually very tricky for a lot of artists to develop the illustration of a woman who's in her 30s or 40s, which I always thought was interesting, because that's often when women are at the peak of their sort of social and economic power. So there would be revisions for that. But then what would happen is, for example, I remember distinctly thinking, like with the magic, that I don't like, when you see a TV show with magic in it, or a movie, and all it is just magic appearing out of hands, right? And just like lights appearing out of hands. And I thought it's not very interesting to me. And I like the idea that what if the Jantep initiates like Kellen are banded? They have these tattoos, these metallic tattoos that are imprinted on them. And that's what lets them connect to the magic, to the source of magic, but they can't use it until they can actually make what they call in the book sparking their bands, like cause the magic to channel through those bands, which meant that then the poor artist has to go back and redraw it so that there are these tattooed bands on the character's arms. And so there was multiple of these types of things that happened. And then we had a discussion where originally Rikus, the squirrel cat, one of the main, the animal character that we talk about, was originally going to be a raccoon, because I live in Vancouver and I know you live not so far away. And so that we have raccoons that are quite mischievous and interesting characters to be around. And so that was the original inspiration for Rikus, was going to be a cross between sort of a raccoon and my cat. But when they were looking to sell the movie rights, of course, the entertainment lawyer said, who's going the agent for film rights said, it's going to be hard to get a director to want to risk creating a live talking raccoon character because of Guardians of the Galaxy. They never want to look like theirs is worse than someone else's. So there was all this debate about what it was going to be like, and it took an incredible amount of back and forth debate over every different kind of animal you could think of was under discussion. And finally, we settled on creating an animal that doesn't exist in our world called the squirrel cat, which is kind of like a sort of half feline giant flying squirrel. Because we thought it was hilarious and funny. And so then we had to go back to the poor artist and say, okay, by the way, you got to change the raccoon to something else. And at that point, and I feel terrible about this because, like I say, Dale Halverson's one of my favorite illustrators. And so hopefully he's forgiven me by now. But he just said, that's it. I'm done. I'm off. And so the funny thing is, Sam Hadley, who's a different illustrator, had to illustrate this squirrel cat that you see on the cover of the book. And for those of you who are listening in audio, of course, you can look up the UK cover for Spellslinger and you'll see it. But the imagine how hard it is for an illustrator to have to add an image to someone else's illustration and match their style as perfectly as Sam Hadley did the style of Dale Halverson. And so that was my favorite. I mean, I felt bad because I know it was frustrating for the artists, but there was such an odd part of the revision process. I've never had that happen before, where I'm making changes to the story and then an artist is having to go back and redraw or alter the illustration that they've done to match.
Interesting trivia, Mr. Sebastian. So, how do you ensure your ending is satisfying and ties up loose ends on Spellslingers?
Oh, that's a really good question. So there was a particularly interesting moment in the revision process where at the end of Spellslinger, and I won't spoil the ending, but I will say there's a kiss involved at one point, and it's not a romance novel. I don't tend to write romantic novels, or at least everyone assures me that I'm terrible at writing romance. But it was something of an important moment between two characters, and my editor had said at the time, listen, the ending of the book is great, we love it, but I think you should drop this kiss between these two characters. And I said, why? And she said, well, because this other character is never going to show up again. And I said, what do you mean they're never going to show up again? I haven't written the other books yet. I said, yeah, but they're not a very interesting character. They don't, they're not important. Let's just kind of cut that and everything's fine. And I realized, and I thought, well, I tend to be quite belligerent in that sense. Like, it's not that I'll disagree with a critique, but I almost always disagree with the solution. And I thought, well, I don't want to remove that moment, because the character's not interesting. I need the character to be interesting. And so I went back and rewrote the scenes with that character and brought them into other scenes to give them a fuller arc. And then all of a sudden, my editors were saying, and my publisher was saying, "Oh, can we bring her back in book 2 because she's really an exciting character," and she becomes an important character throughout the series. Those of your listeners who've read Spellslinger will know who I'm talking about, and so that's one of the things that I realized when you talk about how do you make sure that an ending is satisfying and fulfilling. It's often less about the ending than what you did to set up that ending. The ending of a book, in a lot of ways, of a novel, should be the easiest part to write because you've just built everything up to it. But when you're finding as a novelist that your ending doesn't feel quite satisfying, you almost can never fix it by changing the ending. You can only fix it by changing what came before, so that ending that was your first natural impulse of how to end the book is actually fulfilled by all of the setup work ahead of time.
Amazing ending, Mr. Sebastian. But before we go on, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our 4th season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of 5-star hotel in downtown Toronto. Please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about one of the favorite Japanese stock, dashi people. So please do listen, Food 101. So Mr. Sebastian, can you please read one of your favorite chapter of Spellslinger?
Sure. I'm going to read from, it's a little bit later in the book, in fact, but it's a scene that I don't know. I just always quite enjoyed. I enjoyed writing it a lot, and it's the first time that Rikus, the squirrel cat, kind of shows up and sort of to help Kellen, or at least negotiate with Kellen. So before this, Rikus is what's called by Kellen's people a nekek, and a nekek is supposed to be a type of demon that his people, hate and try to hunt down. But of course, he's not. He's a squirrel cat. It's a type of animal that they have a certain attunement to magic that allows them to kind of communicate with humans when they choose to. And Kellen, at this point in the book, has just been counterbanded by his parents. So counterbanding is where those tattooed metallic bands I told you about, they actually inscribe reverse sigils inside them to prevent you from ever using your magic. And that's because his parents fear that he has this mystical illness that will turn him into a demon. And so poor Kellen is on the 5th day of that process. He's strapped to a table. He's every night he's having another type of magic stripped away from him. And so this is the scene where Rikus first shows up, and I'll just read a few pages for you. So Spellslinger chapter 28, The Negotiation. There was a moment when the squirrel cat had first appeared at the window when I thought I might be hallucinating. I was still drugged after all, and I'd been strapped down to this table for several days. "Are you simple, kid?" the creature asked. "Simple? Slow, dumb, thick, stupid." "I get it," I said. "The answer is no." The animal reached a paw into the narrow 3-inch gap that separated the two wood-framed horizontal panes of glass. They were secured in position by a lever that required a small key to unlock it. When I was younger, I used to try for hours to find a way to get it open, with everything from thin steel pins to a mallet. "You won't be able to open it," I informed the animal as he floundered at it with his paw. "The only way is if you have—" The lock slid off the lever and down onto the floor. The two halves of the window swung open, and the squirrel cat clambered onto the sill and settled onto his haunches. "How did you do that?" I asked. "Do what?" "Undo the lock." He looked at me with a quizzical expression on his furry muzzle, his head tilted to one side. "I thought you said you weren't simple." The sound of another chittering voice came from outside. It seemed to irritate him. He turned his head towards the open window. "It was a joke," he said. "I'm being friendly." "You brought another—" It occurred to me that I wasn't sure how to refer to the animal. Did they prefer being called squirrel cats or nekeks? "She insisted on coming," he said, turning back to me. He raised his shoulders towards his ears and dropped them again. I took this to be a shrug. "Females, am I right?" I had absolutely no idea what he meant. "Yeah, females," I said, then, feeling particularly awkward, asked, "Do you have a name?" He chittered something at me, then, seeing the confusion on my face, repeated it. "Rikus?" I asked. "Close enough." He hopped off the windowsill and onto the table, then crawled onto my chest, his claws tapping against the fabric of my shirt. I had to stop myself from trying to shake him off. I'd seen what those claws could do. "So," he said, peering at me with those beady black eyes, "we should probably get the negotiations started." "Negotiations?" He let out a breath that I caught full in the nostrils. It was disgusting. "You sure you ain't—" "I'm not simple," I said, irritation temporarily overcoming my anxiousness. "I've just never negotiated with a squirrel cat, that's all." "You don't say." He sat back on my chest, leaning on his haunches as he glanced around my father's study, his eyes pausing on every shiny bauble and metal instrument. "Nice place you have here," he said. He brought his paws up to just below his whiskers and started clacking his claws together as his thick, bushy tail twitched excitedly. "Why are you doing that?" I asked, suddenly suspicious. Rikus seemed surprised. "Doing what? I'm not doing—" "You're tapping your paws together." "No, I'm not," he said, and immediately brought them back down. "Yeah, you were. I saw you. What does it mean?" He hesitated. It's something my people do when we're, intimidated by a superior intellect." He looked down at me. "That's why I'm going to free you in exchange for only 5 of these little trinkets you have here." 5? I'm not sure why the number bothered me. None of the items in the room belonged to me anyway, but I had the feeling he was trying to con me. "It's a good deal, kid, trust me." He started blinking his eyes at me in a strange, repetitive pattern. "You want this deal, kid. You want to say yes." My experience with squirrel cats was admittedly limited, but there was a connection between us that made me recognize what he was doing. "Are you trying to mesmerize me?" I asked. "What? No." He stopped the blinking. I don't even know what that is. Mesmerizing? Never heard of it." "You're a terrible liar," I said. That seemed to genuinely offend him. "I'm an excellent liar," he growled, baring his teeth at me. "You tell anyone otherwise and I'll—" He was interrupted again by the chittering from outside. "Gods damn it, leave me alone," he muttered. Squirrel cats have gods? He started chittering back to the other animal out the window, too quickly for me to follow what he was saying. Then he turned back to me and grunted, "Fine. Look, kid, since technically you set me free from those other skin bags, I'll get you out of your current predicament for free." He turned back to chitter out the open window. "Even though I saved his stupid sister from bonding with that sick mutt, which is how I got nabbed in the first place." The sounds of movement in the house drew our attention, I realized then that the moon was coming up fast, and soon my parents would be coming in to begin the next band. Oh, spirits of the first mages, I prayed. Please don't let them do it to me again. Hey, kid, Rikus said, suddenly sniffing around my face. Put a dam in that river. We've got work to do. I'm not crying, he said. He gave his little ha 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 laughing sound. Now who's a terrible liar? I'll stop it there so that I don't spoil too much.
Bravo, Mr. Sebastian, and thank you for sharing your talents to the world. So can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Sure, yeah. As we've talked about on previous episodes, I have a lot of different series out there. I have 16 different novels. So I know a lot of readers these days like to be able to read a series that's complete. They like to sort of binge through a series. So the Great Coats Quartet is a 4-book swashbuckling fantasy series that's done really well out in the world and won some awards and got lots of acclaim. And so if you're interested in something that has a bit of a Three Musketeers meets Game of Thrones kind of vibe to it, with lots of banter and themes of friendship and idealism, then the Great Coats Quartet is for you. Trader's Blade is the first book in that series. And if you haven't already seen it, Daniel and I did an episode on that recently. The Spellslinger series is of course a good series if you like magic and adventure and thieving, murderous, talking squirrel cats, as we've shown. And that's a 6-book series, and it's complete. There's also, if you're looking for something a little more violent and full of swearing, Malevolent 7 is kind of my homage to the Magnificent Seven, the classic Western, only with mages going around blowing things up and swearing all the time. And if you want a YA series that has a female protagonist instead, start with Way of the Argosi, which tells the story of our friend Ferius Parfax, and when she was young and how she became the rather amazing person she is once we meet her in Spellslinger. So, and if you want to reach me, decastell.com is my website, DECASTELL.com. I'm very easy to find. There's a contact page there, and I reply to every single email I get, so long as you're not claiming to be a Nigerian prince offering me $1 million.
We need $1 million, people. And thank you, Mr. Sebastian, for your time for this podcast, and more books to come. So people, let's support Mr. Sebastien de Castell. So Mr. Sebastian, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.